We're headed into marketing-mandated territory in this Atari archive with brain games. The vast majority of the early VCS games covered so far were games that the developers were personally interested in putting together. Whether these were ports of popular arcade games, conversions of tabletop time wasters, or novel concepts, marketing had largely stayed out of the way on what games came along and focused on selling them. But there were exceptions, and among those are the 3 games we'll be covering in this and the next 2 videos as we close out 1978. The issue here is the VCS's mix of controllers. You've got the 2 major ones that were packed in with the console itself from the get-go, the joystick and the paddle controllers. The vast majority of the games on the platform use the joystick, which is surprisingly flexible for having 1 button. A smaller number use the paddle controller, which is much more limited in the types of games that it excels at. Developer Larry Kaplan noted that marketing specifically requested that the programmers create games that use the paddles to ensure that users were still getting, some use out of them, which is why he put together Street Racer. The VCS also hosted 2 other controller types though, the driving controller, used in the system's heyday with only Indy 500, and the keypad controller. The keypad controller is more reminiscent of the keypads on the RCA Studio 2 or the APF MP1000 than any other type of control scheme on the VCS. It's little more than an input device with 12 buttons, though since it supplants other controller types in whatever ports it's in, the keypads end up being useful only for very specific games. According to the history book Atari, Business is Fun, the keypad controllers were actually a byproduct of work being done by the VCS hardware design team, which was looking for ways to enhance the console after its launch. Aside from being designed for logic games and a potential BASIC cartridge, these various enhancements would ultimately come together in Atari's 8-bit computer line in 1979. All told, 10 games would use the VCS keypad controller, or its later aesthetic variants, the children's controller and the video touchpad, and 3 of those will show up right now at the end of the year. Originally advertised in October 1978, the keypad controller and its launch titles, Brain Games, Codebreaker, and Hunt and Score, were also noted in the January 1979 merchandising issue as being now available, which would have been put together in December. In either case, we're going in alphabetical order, so first up is Brain Games. Developer Larry Kaplan has no strong memories of creating Brain Games. He recalls that the marketing department told the programmers that they were putting together these keypad controllers and that the company wanted games to go with them. At the time, he, David Crane, Bob Whitehead, and Alan Miller largely worked together in their own lab, and when a game was complete they, quote, threw it over the wall, unquote, to sales and marketing. As a result, he didn't have any of the other keyboard-centric developers to talk with. Instead, the ideas for the various game types in Brain Games were things he had to come up with on his own, supplemented by familiar puzzle games found in magazines and on computer systems, as well as an obscure Atari arcade game concept that was about to get its second wind. Kaplan said that he had to rush to finish the game by Christmas, and he doesn't consider it being particularly good. Atari first announced the game was coming in May under the working title Wizard, alongside announcements for what would become basketball, flag capture, and slot racers. That announcement ended up appearing in the June 1978 issue of Merchandising. That information was already a bit outdated, though. By the June CES show, Wizard had already been renamed to Brain Games when it was shown alongside 6 other cartridges. Brain Games, the title Kaplan's collection was eventually sold under, is headlined by an official home conversion of Atari's 1974 arcade game Touch Me. This game featured 4 buttons that would light up and produce sound effects. The player's goal is to keep track of the sequence order and follow it. Each time it's been successfully completed, another button press is added to the sequence. If this sounds familiar, it's because this was the exact same concept Ralph Baer would use for his 1978 toy Simon. Bayer saw Touch Me at a 1976 Music Operators of America trade show and thought that it had a good play loop, but was visually and aurally terrible. Howard Morrison, who Bayer worked with through toy and game design group Marvin Glass & Associates, agreed, and they both thought it was worth looking into a handheld version of the game. Working with software guru Lenny Cope of Sanders Associates, they were able to program and build out a prototype unit in 1977, which was then successfully pitched to Milton Bradley, hit stores in Christmas 1978, and became a massive hit for years to come. Atari started selling its own handheld version of Touch Me the following year, making Kaplan's video game rendition the company's first attempt to revive it for a new audience. If you've ever played Simon, you know exactly what to expect from the VCS version of Touch Me. The game will introduce a tone, requiring you to match it by hitting the corresponding button, either using 6 buttons or 9 depending on the game type. Each round will add a new tone to the sequence, maxing out at 32. If you complete that 30-second sequence or mess up 4 times, the game ends. You can adjust the challenge further with the difficulty switches. Turning it to A will only give you a new tone, requiring the player to remember all the older ones. Brain Games also has a similar game type to Touch Me called Count Me, which essentially reverses the visual information. Instead of matching tones to the buttons on screen, the game will instead show a number with the sound effect, and the player has to push that corresponding button as they go through the sequence. It essentially plays the same, so if you're someone who likes Touch Me, you'll probably enjoy Count Me as well. Next on the cartridge is Match Me, a memory game. The VCS will briefly display a series of pictures, top to bottom, while matching it with an irritating sound effect as an attempt to distract the player. Once they vanish, the player has 20 seconds to arrange them properly, getting points for each correct answer and bonus points for speed. After 5 sets of objects, the game ends. The 2 Match Me game types only differ on how long you get to look at the original order before they disappear, either 4 seconds or 1.5. Difficulty switches simply adjust the bonus scoring to either be half the remaining timer or have it be 1-to-1. It's a neat little distraction for a couple minutes, but there's not much in way of longevity here. This brings me to Find Me, the next game on the cartridge. This game is also a memory test, but this time the focus is on subtlety. The player is shown a column of 4 images. 3 of these are identical, but one of them has a minor difference. Generally a pixel that has been shuffled around. It's on the player to identify and select that image using the keypad, where each row of numbers corresponds to one of the images on the column. Depending on the game type selected, either 1 or 2 players has either 20 seconds or 5 seconds to find which image is not like the others. The pressure is surprisingly real in the 5-second game types, which can lead to errors and just entirely missing which one is different. Like Match Me, the difficulty switches adjust how many bonus points you get from the timer. Add Me seems confusing at first, but is actually pretty simple. The game will show players a series of numbers, at which point you simply have to add up the value of all the digits and type in the correct answer using the keypad. With 2 players, it's a battle of basic math skills and the shame of adding up the numbers wrong. With a single player, it loses a lot of the tension. Game types will adjust whether the game gives you 4 digits and 20 seconds to add them, or 5 digits and 5 seconds. Much like the previous 2 games, the difficulty switches adjust your point value from the timer. The final game on this cartridge is Play Me, which is less a game and more of a free-range sound program. Each of the keypad controllers takes over one of the TIA chip's 2 sound channels, with each button producing a different tone. The idea here is that you could use both of them to make music, and the instruction manual even includes a few sample songs using one or both controllers. To my knowledge, this might be the first tool designed for a gaming machine to produce homemade chiptune music, though the limitations of the VCS's audio capabilities and the inability to play anything back keeps this program from really shining. Needless to say, Kaplan slapped together as many ideas for games as he could think of that would use the keypad controllers with this collection, but it's not a particularly exciting release. Touch Me is the standout title here, and that's really because of the Simon connection. The other game types are usually over in a matter of couple minutes, though considering how easily any of them could overstay their welcome, that's probably for the best. If you're into renditions of early puzzle games, this could provide a few minutes of entertainment. Otherwise, Brain Games is probably the least interesting of these first 3 keypad controller games. Kaplan wasn't the only person to hit on some of these game ideas, as they would appear on several other platforms. Touch Me, for example, showed up on the Magnavox Odyssey 2 cartridge Mathemagic/Echo as the titular Echo game. This utilizes the system's built-in keyboard, allowing players to simply press the key to match the tone. And unsurprisingly, the RCA Studio 2 with its built-in keypads will factor into these next couple videos as well. In this case, Add Me has a counterpart built into the console itself called Addition. It plays almost exactly the same. Add up the numbers before your opponent and get some points. Like many of Atari's other 1978 offerings, Brain Games seems to have hit store shelves in the fall. The September 19th edition of the Rapid City Journal out of South Dakota advertised it alongside several other 1978 releases in a J.C. Penney ad, but the next ads listing the game don't show up until October, including in the October 13th Honolulu Advertiser and the October 18th Los Angeles Times, which goes so far as to say it is now available. The game is also mentioned in the January 1979 edition of merchandising, as already noted, so it's likely that the game was available alongside its fellow keyboard controller titles throughout North America at some point leading up to the Christmas holiday. At the time, Brain Games seemed to have been looked at as a title to test one's mental acuity, much as Nintendo's Brain Age would do some 26-odd years later. The title is mentioned in the Chicago Tribune's breakdown of video game consoles published March 14, 1979, where author Roger Verhulst said it emphasized concentration and mental agility, unlike more action-oriented titles. Steve Goldstein of the New York Daily News referred to it as one of the company's educational games in his January 21st piece about setting up the ideal sports fan dream room, which includes a VCS for downtime entertainment. In 1982, Brain Games would get a second wind of sorts, being paired with later release basic programming as the Back to School Pack. On the whole, I'm not entirely sure how useful Brain Games would be for education, but someone in Atari's marketing department clearly saw an opportunity, if nothing else, to try and move these games in excess keyboard controllers. Under the Atari Corporation years, Brain Games continued to be sold, albeit in fairly small quantities. The company moved about 5,900 in 1987, but scarcely more than a few hundred from 1986 through 1990 beyond that. Though really, even those sales are impressive for a fairly mediocre package of games using a largely overlooked specialty controller. While you could do worse than to play Brain Games, it was a fairly marginal game in its day, and it's a hard title to recommend so many years later. Next time, we continue to power through the keypad lineup with a title for Masterminds.